Boa tarde, meu querido público do DCM. Hoje eu estou aqui com o Carlos Martins Brar. Ele é um autor, pesquisador e ativista político britânico. Ele é autor do Oriente Ainda é Vermelho. Eu tenho até esse livro aqui, vou mostrar para vocês. Onde que eu fui no livro? Ai, meu Deus, não estou encontrando. Daqui a pouco eu mostro. Espera aí, tá aqui em algum lugar. Eu sei que vocês são muito visuais, tá? E ele também escreveu vários livros. O Fim do Começo, Lições do Colapso Soviético, é coeditor com Keith Bennett, do China Popular aos 75, A Bandeira Continua Vermelha. O Carlos também é coeditor da plataforma Friends of Socialist China, nós vamos falar sobre isso, como vocês podem participar. Membro do comitê e coordenador internacional do Manifest Group. Ele escreve regularmente para o único jornal socialista britânico, Morning Star, Beijing Review, Global Times, publicou diversos artigos em revistas acadêmicas chinesas, incluindo International Critical Thought e World Review. Não tá na biografia dele, mas eu diria que ele é um dos maiores especialistas hoje de China no Reino Unido. Carlos, thank you for being with us here with our Brazilian audience. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with you and to talk with us a little bit.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Great to be with you.
Carlos, first of all, I want to talk about China in contemporary terms. I want to talk about the influence in the global South. But there are some main questions that people have about China. Is China capitalist? Is China socialist? What is China economic model? We can't agree on that. It seems on the left we can't agree, especially in Brazil. So we have some experts saying, well, it's a hybrid of capitalism and socialism. Others say, no, it's a full-blown capitalist country. And I think most people are confused. So in your book, The East is Still Red, you defend that China is a socialist nation and not with any type of other ism. Can you explain to us, please?
That's the quote from President Xi Jinping, that socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism. It's not any other type of ism. So he's kind of directly answering that accusation that it's a variety of capitalism. I mean, I think it's pretty understandable that people look at modern China and say that it's capitalist because it's got lots of features that you might expect to see in a capitalist country, right? You've got a huge amount of private capital, you've got many private enterprises, you've got market mechanisms within the economy for price allocation and things like that. You've got the exploitation of human labor. You've got a group of people who own and deploy capital, and you've also got a group of people that have got no choice but to sell their labor power, right? You've got global brands in China. You go to Beijing, you go to Shanghai, you go to Guangzhou, and you're going to see Starbucks, you're going to see McDonald's, you're going to see KFC, etc., and all sorts of things. These US brands or these global brands that you kind of think, what's this got to do with socialism? This is the first thing I want to do when we have a socialist revolution is get rid of these brands. I don't want to be drinking Starbucks the day after the revolution. You've got lots of foreign investment in China. You've got Chinese integration into global value chains. You've got billionaires. You've got a few hundred billionaires in China. So you've got a whole bunch of things that feel pretty capitalist. But then there's a contradiction and a disparity because you've also got a few things that don't feel very capitalist or that don't fit with our notions of what capitalism is. China is the world leader in poverty alleviation, right? They've had this enormous project to lift every single person, in a population of 1.4 billion above the poverty line, such that they've got a basic, minimum income, they've got a roof over their head, they've got housing, they've got food on the table, they've got clothing, their children get 10 years of free education. If they get sick, they see a doctor, they've got running water in their homes, and they've got, modern energy, electricity piped into their homes. So, everyone, they've had this project, they've mobilized these resources, including literally 3 or 4 million cadres from the Communist Party that have gone to the villages, that have gone to the remote areas, that have worked with communities, with families. to figure out what needs to be done to get them out of poverty. They've done it, they've achieved it. So that's something that no other country has done, right? So, and it's not something that you would expect to happen in a capitalist country. You know, you see more poverty in London, where I am right now, in North London, than you would see in Beijing, than you would see in Shanghai, right? China is the world leader in renewable energy. China is the only country that's really kind of not just organized on ecological matters in terms of rhetoric and in terms of slogans and in terms of, you know, making bold statements about what we're going to do, but they've actually done it to the extent where that China now produces 60% of the world's renewable energy and is the world leader in electric vehicles, batteries, all kinds of electric transport, biodiversity protection, forestation, and so on. And, you know, you've got this amazing provision of public goods in China, infrastructure, you know, a high-speed rail that stretches out throughout the whole country. You know, it's not just in the big cities on the eastern seaboard. It's not just in Beijing and Shanghai. It's also in Xi'an. It's also in Gansu province, in Xinjiang province, in Tibet, etc., etc. And you've had this remarkably rapid development of science and technology, which has never been seen in the world before. So how has China been able to achieve all of these things as, you know, an enormous Asian developing country, up until quite recently one of the poorest countries in the world? You know, at the time of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, it was literally, you know, in the top, you know, bottom 10 poorest countries in the world, right? And most backwards in terms of its scientific and technological development. What's different about China? You know, it's pretty clear that it's not just another capitalist country, right? And, you know, when you investigate the actual nature of China's economy, it's a hybrid economy that has got lots of market elements to it, but what they call the commanding heights, so ownership of land, energy, infrastructure, transport, finance, telecommunications, these things are owned by the state and run by state-owned enterprises. So they're not responsible to shareholders, they're responsible to the public, to the population at large, right? The major banks, like the 4 big banks in China, are state-owned. So again, they're making decisions not on the basis of what's going to give us a really good quarterly profit report, but what's good for the country, what's in line with our planning system. They've got a planning system. You know, the economy is essentially centered around their 5-year plans. Even the private sector of the economy is very heavily regulated. So, you know, it's profoundly different to the economic system that you would find in the United States or in Britain or in Europe. And the other very important thing is, apart from these economic factors, which are of course related, but there's the political factor, and this is really the most important aspect, is the political power of the working class. Like, there's no capitalist class in China that can organize politically as a class, right? You know, you can be a capitalist.
Tell me more about it.
You can be a human being with a lot of money who owns companies or who owns and deploys capital, and you can be politically organized. You can have your political beliefs, and you can even join the Communist Party if you agree with its principles. You can join one of the other 8 democratic parties, but what you can't do is form a political party which is a capitalist political party which aims to restore or introduce capitalism in China. You can't organize on the basis of your own class interests. If you want to join the Communist Party, you can, but then you have to be, you know, a class traitor. You know, you have to work for the overall long-term interests of the country and the working class and the global working class. So the political power of the working class and of the peasantry and their allies is exercised through the leadership of the Communist Party, a party which is committed to, you know, this long journey to socialism, which is committing to uphold the people's interests. So, you know, the economy is subordinated ultimately to the needs of the people and to the needs of the planet increasingly, rather than to the profit motive of a capitalist class, which is how capitalism works, right? That's the definition of capitalism, essentially. The development and all kind of economic activity are subordinated to the needs of individuals and companies to make profits. So, you know, and that's why China can achieve what other countries can't achieve. You know, compare China with, you don't have to compare China with Britain. You don't have to compare China with the United States. You can compare China with India. Very similar countries in terms of their size, in terms of the location. Both have got a population of 1.4 billion. China got its liberation in 1949. India got its liberation in 1947. Both had suffered, you know, very terribly in the century or two before that.
Carlos,
we're in a state of, you know, fairly exclusive.
You touch an aspect that, of course, as a lawyer, it triggers another question here. I don't know if you know the answer. You're saying in China, you cannot, the capital cannot co-opt politics, and it's not possible for one person to form a capitalist party that will overthrow the socialist idea. So generally, as a lawyer, I was thinking, wow, is this written in the Constitution? Is this is a legal barrier? Because, or is this just a political barrier? How is this controlled?
Oh yeah, that's part of the Constitution, absolutely. And you know, China, like any state, has mechanisms, an apparatus of repression that they can prevent things happening, you know, prevent unconstitutional activity. And, you know, at the end of the day, the People's Republic of China still exists and is still very strong. If they had just allowed capitalists to organize, then People's Republic of China would have been overthrown a very long time ago.
So you give us a very important argument to understand China, because any barriers to the free market, the free exploitation, it's read by the outsider as authoritarianism. When you're telling me, no, it's just a constitutional control of a socialist constitution. There are barriers, like every healthy country should have barriers in their constitution. You know, that, like, people say that in Germany they have a democratic constitution, so they are, how much democracy does democracy in Germany allows, and they have their own barriers. It's very interesting. So you're telling me that China has a socialist constitution?
Yeah, 100%.
Amazing. Okay.
100%. I mean, you know, China has obviously changed a lot since 1949, and it's gone through different phases. You know, and the most obvious and important phases are probably the first 3 decades of more formally socialist development, where almost everything was state-owned, almost everything was centrally planned, and there was, you know, almost no exploitation of labor. And then since 1978, you've had what they call the reform and opening up. But the constitutional provisions have not changed very much. And it still considers itself a socialist country, and it still organizes its state and its repressive mechanisms on that basis. And yes, they prioritize the certain freedoms over other freedoms, right? You know, they don't give absolute freedom to capital, because that's what happens in a capitalist system. You know, that's how we in the West conceptualize freedom, right? That capital has as much freedom as possible, whereas China
it's one of the delusional premises we're living. I want to talk to you about China's socialist model on a political level. So China begins now its 15th five-year plan. Can you explain to our audience what does that mean? The five-year plans from China, and why specifically now, what lessons does Chinese plan offer for the global South nation now under extreme coercion from US and Trump?
Sure. You know, a five-year plan is like a roadmap for the economy that comes with specific targets, specific priorities, and it is kind of a system that was inherited from the Soviet Union to a degree. I think the Soviet Union implemented its first five-year plan starting in maybe 1928. So this is a very long-standing thing in the world of actually existing socialism, right? But, you know, the way Chinese run their five-year plans these days is quite different to what it was like in the Soviet Union, and quite different to what it was like, you know, even in China in the first 20, 25 years of the People's Republic. So it's much more focused on kind of setting targets, setting priorities, setting kind of indicators of the direction that they want the economy to go in, as opposed to saying, right, we're going to produce this much steel and we're going to produce this much iron and we're going to produce this many beds, etc., etc. So, like a lot of the smaller, the details of the economy, a lot of the time they'll let the market take care of that stuff. So the plan is really setting the overall high-level strategy and like deciding what the country and what the country's economy should be really focusing on. It's it's set by the government on the basis of a massive program of data collection and consultation. Like literally millions of people feed into these plans, right? They go through hundreds of drafts. For this current plan, there was an online consultation that took place over the course of a few weeks. It generated, I think it was over 3 million public submissions that resulted in like 1,000 or 2,000 like actual concrete proposals. So it's actually, in a sense, it's a very democratic process. And it's got some echoes of sort of participatory budgeting, which being Brazilian, you will know all about,
Yeah.
Brazil is like Sao Paulo is the most famous site for participatory budgets, but really.
Oh, it's here, Belo Horizonte. We've gone here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in a way, like this planning process in China is very participatory, it's very democratic. But the plan is then set, it becomes a framework for all economic activity. It feeds into investment decisions, it feeds into resource allocation, into regulation, into enterprises planning, and so on. Yeah, I think this plan, this 15th plan, is particularly important. Firstly, it's halfway to the 2035 target. So the government has this target of what they call basically achieving socialist modernization by 2035. So this plan is going to take us to 2030, which is halfway there. So for that reason, it's got a major focus on innovation, on technology, on green development, on renewable energy, semiconductors, and getting to the point where China is competitive with the United States in relation to semiconductors and the actual kind of physics of computing, artificial intelligence, manufacturing, transportation, cyberspace. And one thing that you'll notice about it as well is that there is a strong focus on the real economy, like the production of things, not just financial speculation, which is what most of the Western economies are based on. Not, no real focus on fictitious capital, but actual productive economy. It also includes social targets that are built in, in terms of improving the income distribution so that there's more equality. So they're aiming to reduce inequality. And China notoriously has quite high inequality. The level of inequality in China is actually reducing year by year, whereas in the rest of the world, it continues to increase. Building up a stronger social safety net, improving public health, improving education, improving reducing the urban-rural divide so that living conditions improve faster in the rural areas. And this idea of rural revitalization is a central component. This current 5-year plan also includes a proposal to get to average life expectancy of 80 years by the end of the plan, which is, for a massive Asian developing country is a big thing, right? And China's life expectancy is currently 79 years. So they're looking, which is already ahead of that of the United States, and they're looking to get it up to 80 years. And then the other thing about the plan is that it's a very complicated geopolitical context, right?
Absolutely.
The US is pursuing a new Cold War strategy and trying to hobble China's progress through the tariff war, through an escalating campaign of encirclement, escalating campaign of containment. So the plan emphasizes the importance of, one, building like self-reliance, being able to rely on its own resources and its own people more, having less dependence on the United States, less dependence on the West in general, and diversing its trade partners, especially in terms of really developing its cooperation with and mutual benefit relationships with the global South, so reducing its dependence on hostile forces. In terms of the lessons that Chinese planning offers for other global South nations, I mean,
Maybe the plan itself, it's an example for Global South nations, because what I'm listening here is, Carlos, as while we have lobbies, capitalistic lobbies determining the budget, we just saw the one big beautiful bill to militarize the US. It stays as a contrary example of that. It seems that this plan, it's far more, we, the people, decide what China is investing and not bailing out banks and putting $170 billion on an ice in a racial war. It seems incredible. It's great.
Yeah. Unfortunately, not every country can just decide to do that, right? Because that ability to plan in that way and to focus the economic resources in a certain way and emphasize common prosperity and reducing inequality and taking a very long-term approach to development and modernization, that relies on the things that we were talking about before, right? It relies on a particular historical, social, political context. Most importantly, the political power of the working class and its allies, right? China can do certain things because the working class is in charge. And if the bourgeoisie was in charge, if the capitalist class were in charge, or if a feudal class were in charge, or if you had, like you have in many of the countries of South Asia, like this strange power balance between a feudal class and a capitalist class, where the working class and the peasantry have almost no input into how governance takes place, then you can't just do all these things and you can't plan your economy in the way that China does that. But obviously there's something to learn from China's long-term vision. There's something to learn from its strategic planning. There's something to learn from its intense focus on kind of common prosperity. And also in terms of dealing with Trump, I think the whole world has learned a little something over the last year or so since Trump's Liberation Day and the start of the tariff war, that every country basically did whatever Trump told them to do, except for China. They said, no,
well, Brazil,
we'll match you, right? And as a result of that, okay, China's in a better position to do that than others. It's been diversifying very heavily its trading partners over the course of the last decade, and it's got quite a few levers that it can pull, right? It's got a massive market. It's got its, near monopoly on rare earth minerals and so on. But this just the basic principle of standing up to coercion and finding ways to work around, the flagrant violation of all norms of behavior and relations between states that's represented by the Trump regime. Of course, that's something that other countries, I think, can learn from and increasingly respect.
Yeah, the Trump regime is a great terminology. Maybe I should use it more, because when you're talking, I think, we have a corporate assault on nations. Sometimes I think our analysis is geopolitical. We're still treating countries as nations. They're just borders, assaulted by a corporate coup, and then that makes Karl Marx so topical, because we are in a class struggle, international class struggles, when he says the struggle is not between nations, is between classes. And it is now we achieved the point that this is so patent. But I want to carry on talking to you about something that people were confused. Is China a list? I'm just gonna
Silenciada.
Si te silencio yo a ti. Un momentín, ¿vale? No te preocupes. So China is a rising economical power, no dispute about it. It will soon, so help us God, surpass the United States in overall scale. And we see many geopolitical analysts, including from the left or self-named left, that say China and Russia are competing empires to the US power. I hear this almost on a daily basis. And one example that crossed my mind is how people phrase the Ukraine war. All Russia and Trump just negotiated and a division of spheres of influence. No, honey, putting one on the ground. He's not going to give up once he's going on the ground, you know. And there's the Donbass question of liberation too. If you're so keen in liberating Taiwan and so on, why are you not so keen in liberating Catalonia or liberating Donbass whatsoever? Okay, so is China becoming an empire? Because we do see an expanding influence, but is it an empire or not? I'll unmute you. 1 second. Sorry, that was a background.
Oh, good. Is China an empire? I mean, you know, at the end of the day, we have to carry out analysis on the basis of material reality, right? You know, what are the actual facts of the situation? What does an empire look like? What does imperialism look like? In the case of the United States, it's extremely clear. We know what US imperialism looks like. It's got over 800 overseas military bases. It engages in military aggression, interventions, wars, invasions, occupations, proxy wars, coups, you know, unilateral sanctions, economic coercion, any kind of flagrant violation of international law. Look at what we've seen just this year in terms of the kidnapping of President Maduro and first combatant Celia Flores in Venezuela, you know, the Trump regime taking over Venezuela's oil industry. Look at what we're seeing now with the energy embargo on Cuba. You know, you didn't think that they would find a way to make the blockade of Cuba even more cruel, but they have. You know, they're literally trying to starve Cuba into submission. The United States has got a global infrastructure of power projection, right? It's got NATO, it's got AUKUS, it's got the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It's got tens of thousands of troops stationed around the world. It's got tens of thousands of weapons. Tens of thousands of weapon systems stationed around the world, including very close to China, including in Japan, in Okinawa, in Guam, in Australia, in South Korea. It's got this enormous military budget, $1 trillion, which Trump now wants to make $1.5 trillion. It's got, you know, in terms of its financial levers, it's got a whole system of dollar hegemony, the Wall Street system. It's got systems of unequal exchange. It's got basically control of the global financial system. It's, you know, got a position at the top of most global value chains and technology systems. It monopolizes lots of intellectual property. And it's able to use all of this to extract wealth from the rest of the world, and particularly the global south, and to maintain its dominance, its empire, right? It's able to use structural adjustment. It's able to use loan conditionality, anything you can think of. You know, it's got a massive economic, political, military, diplomatic, cultural system of hegemony. And China does not, right? It's kind of like simple. China hasn't got 800 overseas military bases. It's got one overseas military base in Djibouti, which is like for anti-piracy operations and humanitarian assistance interventions. It's not involved in any military interventions. It's not involved in invading other countries, occupying other countries. It's not sponsoring proxy wars. It's not carrying out coups and assassinations. It doesn't impose illegal unilateral sanctions. It doesn't engage in economic coercion. It very specifically and explicitly respects sovereignty and the principles of non-interference. China has not been involved in a war for almost half a century, right? And the whole record, if you look at the record of the People's Republic of China over the last 76 years, it's extremely peaceful, you know. And where China has got involved in wars, it's got involved in wars on the side of the people being oppressed, on the side of the people being attacked by the United States and its allies. You know, China got involved in the Korean War between 1950 and 1953 on the side of the North Koreans who had been attacked and were facing a genocidal onslaught in which they lost 3 million of their people, and the whole country was turned to rubble. China got involved in the Vietnam War from 1965 on the side of North Vietnam and on the side of the National Liberation Forces of South Vietnam, who were fighting for liberation and reunification of the country against another genocidal onslaught by the United States, which resulted in the deaths of 4 million people. So, you know, China's record is, you know, extremely peaceful, and and oriented towards justice. China's engagement with the global south is based on mutual benefit, it's based on respect for sovereignty, it's based on following the principles of non-interference and win-win cooperation. So it's pretty difficult to make a case, I think, that China is an empire, that China engages in imperialism or neocolonialism. But as you said, it is a rising power. It is growing in influence. It's the world's largest economy if you measure it by purchasing power parity, or the second largest economy if you measure it by nominal GDP. It's the largest trading partner of 2/3 of the world's countries. I think about 3/4 of the world's countries are signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a China-led and China-initiated project. And the vast majority of those countries are obviously in the global south. But all of that by itself, of itself, doesn't make China an empire. And this is something that Hugo Chavez very famously said. He said, China is large, but it's not an empire. China doesn't go around dropping bombs on people. And China and progressive Latin America together constitute what he called a great wall against hegemonism. And the kind of political or ideological point that I think it's useful to bear in mind is that I don't think not only is China not an empire, but I think it's reasonable to say that it won't become an empire either. At least it won't become an empire while it's still a socialist country, while its government is still led by the Communist Party of China, because it's not built on the same economic and political foundations as the United States or Europe or the other imperialist countries. Again, it comes down to the fact that the capitalist class is not in control. A big Chinese company, let's say Huawei, can't just request the Chinese government to intervene on its behalf to overthrow a foreign government or to steal another country's resources, for example. You have this famous quote by the New York Times journalist Thomas Friedman, where he said, you can't have McDonald's, you can't have a success of US capitalism without McDonnell Douglas, without this military component backing and so you don't have the equivalent of that in China at all. Sorry for the interruption, by the way. And China deliberately and systematically organized its foreign policy on the basis of mutual benefit, on the basis of non-interference, peaceful coexistence, respect for sovereignty and sovereign equality, is very strongly oriented towards the global south. And it sees a clear benefit in the highest possible unity of the global south, because with that comes a kind of collective security and the ability to collectively overcome imperialism, overcome empire. So China ensures that it's not going to do anything in its foreign policy that undermines that basic orientation.
I can already hear my audience saying, where does Brazil fit into that? Why do I care about China? Why are you not talking about Brazil? Well, this is something I hear every day. But in the end of the day, we get together, we get along. But yeah, to my audience, we know that in 2025, last year, we had Brazil, roughly 40% of Brazil-China trade is already being settled in local currencies, in yuan and real. We have cut the middleman called US. We have major companies directly doing the whole yuan transaction. And they say it's not about the ideology, it's about money in Brazil. That's a great argument here. So Brazil became the first Latin American country to join China cross-border interbank payment system. So it's like an alternative to the SWIFT monopoly we have between October 2024 and 2025, Brazil reducing US Treasury holdings about 61.3 billion. So it's a $27 reserve, which is a de-dollarization. Actually, we have Brazil as the country that has most de-dollarized, more than India, more than China lately. And the yuan shares in Brazil reserve is larger now, surpasses the euro, is 5.3 in comparison to 4.4 of the euro. So against this backdrop of US imposed tariffs, Brazilian officials have now announced that they will very likely, for the first time, explore a partial Mercosur-China trade agreement. So this means that they will selectively open areas like agriculture, mining, but they will protect the Brazilian manufacturing sectors from the industrialization. This is something that they did never manage to do with Europe, never managed to do anywhere else, like a partial trade agreement. Either you sign a free trade agreement or you succumb. Those are the options so far. So this is, in a way, a change of paradigm. But I want to ask you 3 questions related to this new factual facts. How significant is Brazil's shifts toward the Mercosur agreement, trade agreement, if this happens? What does change in the world? And what would mean that for the global South sovereignty in general lines? And how do you think the Brazil de-dollarization fits in those BRICS broader strategy? It's too many questions. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I'll try and incorporate all of those into a kind of general discussion about de-dollarization. Because this is something that a lot of people are talking about these days, de-dollarization. And from most of the world, we think, well...
Oh, I have de-dollarized my savings. I had $23.50. I gave it to a niece. I've de-dollarized as well. I want to follow the trend. Sorry, good, carry on.
Very good. Well, we need to get that into the statistics, otherwise they won't be complete. Ultimately, de-dollarization is a very important part of an overall strategy for the global South to assert economic sovereignty, right? To break free from the constraints of US hegemony. Because the US has long used the dollar, particularly over the last 50 years, as a tool of economic coercion, as a way to, impose sanctions. It can cut off access to the global financial system for countries that go against its interest. So it's got this as a mechanism for bribery and blackmail, right? And so by reducing reliance on the dollar, countries like Brazil can get more control over their own economies, and they can reduce their level of vulnerability to US pressure. So in that sense, I think the move towards Mercosur-China trade agreement is very significant, because it's an example of South-South cooperation that, as you say, comes without the interference of or dependence on Wall Street, on the dollar system. This is a very important development, and in terms of that growing connection on all aspects of economic ties between Brazil and China, and more generally between Latin America and China, is absolutely despised by the United States. And that's why, because it undermines the US's hegemony. And if you read the National Security Strategy from November last year, that's really that's the subtext. It's like, we're going to reassert control on every level of Latin America and the Caribbean, because that's our backyard. It says it very openly that the US governments for the last 200 years have always pursued the Monroe Doctrine, but it's only the Trump administration, in the modern era at least, that has very openly said, we're doubling down on the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is a good thing. We own this hemisphere, and we can't have China having trade agreements with Brazil, with Peru, or with Chile, or Argentina, or Mexico. That said, de-dollarization is a necessary process, but it's not going to be a fast process, I don't think, because the dollar is very entrenched in the global economy. But the US, especially over the last few years, has seemed like it really wants to help to accelerate this process of de-dollarization, like cutting Russia out of the SWIFT system, like taking a whole country out of the global payment system, is an incredible act of self-harm. Russia's done fine out of that. Russia's found ways around that. But the global payment system will never recover, right? The dollar system will never recover. You're doing something similar with Iran, and then engaging in these crazy tariff wars. the rest of the world is learning. Even the US's allies are learning. Oh, we're talking about a very dangerous and unpredictable and reckless power, and it's an untrustworthy power. We've lost trust in the US, and therefore we lose trust in its currency as well. And the power of a currency is based precisely on global trust in, right? The US Treasury bonds used to be the safest investment you could possibly make, right? I don't think anyone sees them as as the safe haven that they used to be, right? But you've also got to develop an alternative. Like, the dollar is declining in its trust, but you need an alternative. It's not going to be the Chinese renminbi. Like, the renminbi will grow as a reserve currency, but it's not going to replace the dollar. It's not going to play that role, mainly because it's not fully convertible. China's a socialist country. A socialist country will never make its currency fully convertible, because that would mean essentially giving up control over its own economy, exposing itself to speculation attacks and all the rest of it. But the renminbi can become a major reserve currency. The CIPS system that's being developed by different countries can become a major alternative to SWIFT. That's a process that's already happening. And over time, I think it's likely that probably the BRICS countries, that it includes both Brazil and China, will develop a kind of currency basket, or some other mechanism that can gradually, over the course of years, come to play the role of the major global reserve currency.
My problem with China is that they are never in a hurry. I want things to happen quickly, and they're always taking their time. They have this longevity in their plan. It's just so difficult for a person with my personality to sit and wait and see. One day I had a dream it was a crazy dream. It was 2 years ago. I was in Germany. I wanted to take the fast train. This is a dream I had. And I was suddenly in China to go to Germany on the fast train. Everybody was sleeping in the counters, And then somebody said, this is not the time to get a train. You need to wait. So I think this is the tiger. Don't wake the tiger. They have their own pace. They have a sense that goes beyond our individual existence and life. It's so much more in historical changes, invisible changes. It just goes so wild with their philosophy, but it's so difficult for a person like us. Oh, come on, do it quick. I want to see this fall. But in any case, you have ties to India, and I need a bonus. I have a bonus question here on you to India. So we have now BRICS under the presidency of Modi, India. So do you think India can balance? India has an ambivalent role within the US regime and empire. Do you think India, at times, it's very difficult for readers to understand what they stand in this ambivalence, just like Turkey is very difficult to understand what, such an opportunistic situation. So do you think India can balance its role as global South leader? At the same time, they maintain their ties to Washington. Well, how do you think? How do you see this going?
Yeah, first I have to issue a disclaimer that I'm a friend of India. I've been to India many times. My father was Indian. I've got lots of family, lots of friends in India, and it's a country I love. But it's playing a very politically, it's in a bit of a mess, and I think the Indian ruling class is playing a very complicated game, which ultimately probably isn't going to work. India's got a long and pretty proud history of non-alignment and a history of leadership within the global South, right? But it's also got deep, and especially over the last 20, 30 years, has had increasingly deep and strategic ties with the United States. And it's got a powerful domestic capitalist class that's heavily invested in those ties, right? So it's got what you would call, a comprador ruling class. Not the entire Indian capitalist class is comprador. There's a national sovereign element to it, but there's also a very important comprador element to it. So India is trying to sort of walk a tightrope, and I think the complexity of its relationship with China is the biggest, it's the biggest problem, it's the biggest complication, it's the elephant in the room. There's a lot of history there. Some of it goes back to the split between the Soviet Union and China that kind of came out into the open in about 1960. India became more aligned with the Soviet Union. Partly because of that, China became more aligned with Pakistan. India and Pakistan continue to be like mortal enemies. So, there's an element of distrust because of all of that. There's also an ongoing border dispute, which is really, it's people will look back at it in a couple of hundred years' time and will consider it, ridiculous. We're talking about, areas of land where basically nobody lives. You can't grow food there. They're strategically important in a Cold War context, and in a new Cold War context, they're important. But it's a hangover from colonialism, right? It's we're talking about a line that was drawn on a map by a British colonizer, the McMahon line. But there's a lot of elements to a kind of tense, slightly broken relationship between India and China. But on the other hand, India does need Chinese investment. India does need access to China's market. China's a huge, enormous, and very vibrant economy. The two countries could have a very symbiotic relationship. But that's complicated by the fact that the United States wants to do what it always does, which is to triangulate, right? The same thing as it did with the Soviet Union and China, and the same thing as it's trying to do these days between Russia and China. So it's trying to, play India and China off against each other. It's offering India all sorts of, bribes, all sorts of carrots, military aid, trade deals, better deal on tariffs, lower tariffs, etc. Ultimately, in the long term, the best path for India is going to be to mend its relations with China, assert its independence from the US, and there's some indications that that's the direction of travel, right? That's the trajectory. India is a founder member of BRICS. India is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was very positive that Prime Minister Modi went to China last year in, I think it was August, September. He attended the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin. That's a good start. They continue to have high-level dialogue between the two countries, and they've opened up direct flights between Beijing and Delhi again, and they've opened up more investment. But and again, like the kind of this recklessness and this unpredictability and fragility of the Trump regime is kind of a helpful reminder to the Indian ruling class, to the Indian bourgeoisie, that it's not actually a good idea to be over reliant on the United States. So I think that's going to help that whole process as well. As for India's positioning in the global South and this humanity first slogan, etc., I mean, it's nice enough, but it kind of is just a slogan. Like, India wants to have this profile of being a leader on green energy and a leader on people-centered development, and that would make it very popular within the global South. But yeah, as I say, it's more rhetoric than reality. It's not about comparing, and if people are doing good things and moving in the right direction, that's great. But I would say that China's approach to development is a lot closer to humanity first than India's is.
Oh yeah, definitely. Most definitely. Okay, I need to talk to you about Palestine, Sudan, two genocides. So maybe they are the strongest contemporary expression of dispossession, mass displacement, atrocity, shaped by the global power asymmetries of the West, capitalism, and neo-colonial depravity. So beyond symbolism, I think there was a challenge there for us in Palestine, in Sudan. It's moral, it's political test for international solidarity for the future of colonialism, defeating Israel and Palestine's sovereignty. Palestine, it's a it's a cause that touches everyone global-wide in the globe, progressive movements. And Palestine, what happens in Palestine, I think it a bit leads the way for what's happening in terms of colonialism and imperialism in the world. Could be wrong. But my question to you, which is unavoidable, have we, the Global South, met the test? Or have we failed Palestine? Have we failed Africa? Have we failed Sudan as a Global South?
You're giving me any easy questions today.
No, they're all very hard. Yeah, I know. but you meet the test. I'm sure you do. If we have it as Global South, you're more than equipped.
I mean, look, the whole situation, especially with Gaza, it's pretty depressing. I think a lot of people feel that. They feel depressed because it feels like we're impotent, in the face of this extreme violence, literal genocide, war, the threat of war against Iran. What can we do about it? The kidnapping of a president. What can we do about it? The oil embargo on Cuba. What can we do about it? And so on. All of this stuff is happening. And it feels like we're helpless because the United States has got this global infrastructure of power projection and complete disregard for international law. And other countries don't have that. China's got the ability to defend itself, but it doesn't have the ability to project its power. China doesn't even set itself up. It doesn't even try to be, what the US has always called itself, as in the policeman of the world, right? So it's demoralizing, and I think that's the state a lot of us are in at the moment. I think I'm not just trying to be like super optimistic and put lipstick on the whole situation, but I think if you zoom out at a historical level, this pretty crazy and unpredictable behavior of the US and its allies is really an example of what Mao Zedong called hitting out in all directions. Like the US is just desperate, it's just doing anything. It's desperate to maintain its dominance. It's desperate to pursue this, what they call a project for a new American century. But the conditions don't exist for those things to succeed. The conditions don't support those things. We have, the simple fact is that the world has got a trajectory towards multipolarity. The global south is rising, China is rising. BRICS, in terms of its economic size, is now larger than the G7 group of countries, which is a transformation. That wasn't the case 10 years ago, that wasn't the case 20 years ago. It was the case that the countries that currently make up BRICS were about, a quarter of the size economically as the G7 countries. Now they're larger than the G7 countries economically. So there's a power balance, things are moving in a direction. China is the world's largest economy, as we've said, in purchasing power parity terms. It's the largest trading partner of most of the countries in the world, 2/3 of the countries of the world. And even for as much military power as it's got, and even for as kind of recklessly and seemingly randomly as it's willing to use that military power, the US, a lot of the time, it can't actually get what it wants, right? It's done what it's done in Venezuela. It's kidnapped a president. It's bombed some buildings. It's killed, 100 or so people, including 32 Cuban martyrs who were part of the Maduro's presidential guard. And it's saying, okay, we're running the government now. We're going to run Venezuela's oil industry. But they can't. They would love to have regime change in Venezuela. That's what they really want. They want a government in Venezuela that just does what what Washington tells them to do. But they can't get that. They have, in order to do that, they would have to, one, have a credible opposition in Venezuela that supported the imperialist and neoliberal project.
They don't have one.
Yeah, I mean, even Trump said about Maria Corina Machado, it's like, oh yeah, she's great, but the Venezuelan people don't support her, which is hilarious. An amazing thing.
I love U.S. ignorance because they overstate themselves. They they are so ignorant about other cultures that they always think they're bigger than they are. But power is about this, isn't it? To project yourself bigger than you are or smaller than you are. It's never about honesty or self-centeredness.
But this is important. Like they've used an extraordinary amount of power, but they can't get what they want in Venezuela. They can't get what they want in Cuba. They're trying to starve Cuba into submission. But Cuba's still standing, and Cuba will still stand with the support of its friends, and massively mobilized and highly conscious population. The US would love to get regime change in Iran. They would love to get regime change in Iran. A resistant, sovereign, independent Iran is the worst enemy of imperialism. But they can't get what they want, right? They're threatening war. But they know if they bomb Iran into oblivion, they know what Iran is going to do. Iran's got the means to defend itself as well.
Tel Aviv, yeah.
Iran can wipe out large parts of Tel Aviv. They've proved that just a few months ago, right, in the so-called 12-day war. Iran can shut down the flow of oil and gas and all other supplies through the Persian Gulf. They can close the Straits of Hormuz. They can take out multiple, like dozens of US military bases in Qatar, in Kuwait, in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, etc., etc.
Oh, they should they should just.
Iran can basically.
That explains why Trump withdrew after his first attempt, right? That explains because Tel Aviv would say, no, don't mess with Iran anymore because they're going to wipe us out.
Iran could wipe Israel out and it could collapse the global economy. So Iran's got some levers. So, and even with Gaza, which is the most painful, right? It's incredibly painful.
Yeah.
And anyone who's got a heart feels that pain and cries tears for Gaza because what it's gone through is just, it's unbelievable and tragic. But historically, what's happened over the last 2.5 years? How is this period of time going to be remembered by history? Israel has completely lost its legitimacy. The whole
30%
world
of the New York Jews vote for a Muslim.
Right? Yeah. The whole world.
Half of the world put a Muslim mayor.
Who's gonna invest in Israel now? Who's gonna go on holiday in Israel? Right? The whole world hates Israel. The whole world stands with Palestine. Like the question of Palestine is back on the table, and it's never going off the table until the Palestinians have had their basic national rights met and restored. And also the people of the world can see that the US, that Britain, that Europe they didn't stand with the people who were on the receiving end of the genocide, who were fighting for their liberation from colonial occupation and apartheid. They stood with the people that are committing genocide. They stood with the colonizers. They stood with the genociders. So in that sense, just as Israel has lost its legitimacy, so the entire imperialist system is losing its legitimacy. I mean, here in Britain, the government's approval rating is like maybe 15%, right?
11 before the Epstein files. Now we have McSweeney, we have Allen stepping down to avoid inquiries. Sturmer didn't know anything. No, I did not know anything. I went with Mandelson to Washington, D.C. and brought home a $640 million deal to the NHS and MOD, but we did not know anything about Epstein. No. And I don't know if you've seen in the parliament, he was saying he painted his relationship with Epstein as very loose. Well, so you knew about it. If he painted in the vetting process his relationship with Epstein, you're just giving me here in Parliament an admission that you knew it.
Yeah, of course. And everyone knows this as well. Like no one believes, the idea that the Prime Minister wasn't properly briefed by his intelligence agencies on what Mandelson was doing. And the simple fact is, Mandelson was the right guy for the job. You want your top guy in Washington, the guy who's got great connections with the top levels of government and the top levels of business. Who's that guy? That's Peter Mandelson. Why has he got those great connections? Because he's hung out with Epstein so much, because he can cope, he doesn't mind a bit of rape, a bit of sex trafficking, a bit of pedophilia. That's what that's what life is like, in a crumbling empire.
A Brazilian husband that received checks and checks from Epstein to do an osteopathic course. The Osteopathic Society said he was never here. I was looking into his files, and he has a business called Nurture. He was a director since the foundation of this business called Nurture with disability. The business never run.
Yeah. So, all of this, I think it's a sign of like a deeply corrupt system, and increasingly people understand that it's a deeply corrupt system, and that's what's making them look for alternatives. And ultimately, that's going to feed into a socialist project, and it's going to feed into a multipolar project. I mean, one silly example of it maybe is this whole China maxing phenomenon that's taking place now. Like, people are becoming very interested in China. We've got this whole TikTok meme of you've met me at a very Chinese time in my life. And basically, it's because people are looking at what's happening in China, and you've got lots of influencers going to China.
Carlos, my high school. In my time, we had an agreement, an internship agreement with Australia. I went to Australia with a high school. Now they have with China to send people to Chinese universities. Hello.
Yeah, because what a contrast, right? China's a peaceful country. China stands on the side of the global south. China stands on the side of oppressed peoples. China's got amazing infrastructure. China's leading in science, even with stuff like artificial intelligence, right? China's developing all these models, and it makes them open source, so anybody can use them. It's trying to find ways to use artificial intelligence and these large language models to push human understanding forward, and it's sharing that with the rest of the world. Unlike the Facebooks of the world, unlike the Elon Musks of the world, unlike the OpenAIs of the world. So, I think we've got a historic process that's taking place, which is basically the collapse of empire, and it's the growth of multipolarity. But, just what I wanted to say is that progress never moves in a straight line. And I think we quoted Gramsci before when I went on the show.
And always comes too late, progress.
Yeah. I went on the show with I think you and Ileana a couple of months ago, and I said there's an element of this Gramsci quote that the old world is dying and the new world has yet to be born, and now is the time of monsters. I think we're kind of living through the time of monsters.
And I see what you're saying. Historically, we'll look into this moment with a very different light. We have seen the empire exposing itself in an unreversible manner, in an unequivocal manner. Even the people who have been aligned with it and brainwashed or even deceived, they are starting to question. And maybe that's what Hamas wanted. Hamas wanted to bring the Palestinian cause back to the table. Probably that's one of the reasons. Of course, Israel is not going to let it loose, because one of intentions of Israel, I think, is to create something so unbearable. It's just like with Cuba. You make life in Palestine so unbearable that you defeat Hamas from within. Palestinian people will be so angry at Hamas, or so angry with Cuba revolution. They are trying a very vicious strategy. I have to say, even looking historically, I think Brazil has failed brutally. Venezuela has failed brutally. Palestine. We had long-standing members of the Brazilian Labor Party, which is in fact a left-wing party, hasn't been co-opted yet. We do talk socialism. We do talk the language that socialists talk. But they have been very shy about Palestine. And I was talking to people here, and they say, because the Israeli lobby is growing so big, and the biggest Israeli lobby is the neo-Pentecostal churches. So if they talk badly about Israel, 30% of the voters, which is the neo-Pentecostal, will probably move away. So you see the different ways. I think Brazil has brutally failed Palestine, and I feel very ashamed for that. Now, Taiwan. So, Carlo, Western media presents Taiwan as a democratic versus authoritarianism. Taiwan is described as an independent democracy that should give have the right to self-determination, and U.S. military supporting Taiwan to defend their democracy and their rules-based international order, and China claims over Taiwan is a expansionist aggression. Those are the imperialistic script, very well accepted in Brazil. And I ask you, how should the Global South view this issue? What does China restrained approach tell us about the different models of state power?
Look, we should be clear on the most important thing, that under international law, Taiwan is a province of China, right? That's not really ambiguous. It's got some de facto autonomy, and that's like a hangover from colonialism, from the colonial period, right? Taiwan was colonized by Japan in the 1890s. Then at the end of the Second World War, it was agreed at the Potsdam Conference, at the Yalta Conference, that Taiwan would be returned to China after the war, after the defeat of the Japanese Empire, right? As it turned out, after the Second World War finished, the Chinese Civil War broke out, and the Kuomintang party, the nationalist party that lost that civil war, fled to Taiwan, and where it set up, a separate government. That problem would have been solved immediately, within a few months. Taiwan would have been very quickly incorporated, reintegrated into China, were it not for the United States stepping in to prop up Taiwan, de facto independent Taiwan, prop up the Kuomintang regime as a bulwark against communism, that can be used against China and against the Soviet Union. The Truman administration sent its Navy, the 7th Fleet of the US Navy, into the Taiwan Straits to make it very clear, if the People's Republic of China attempts to absorb Taiwan by force, then we're going to go to war against you. And you're talking about a very extremely poor country that's recovering from, by that point, over 20 years of incredibly brutal war in which it's lost tens of millions of people, right?
Wow.
And by the way, that had nothing to do with democracy whatsoever. The US didn't even talk about democracy. That's a modern thing where we talk about Taiwanese democracy. The Kuomintang maintained a pretty brutal dictatorship well into the 1980s, right? So when the United States was supporting it all of that time and sponsoring Taiwanese separatism, that had zero to do with human rights or freedom of speech or democratic elections and the parliamentary system, right? So since 1971, the United Nations has recognized the People's Republic of China with its capital in Beijing as the sole legitimate government of China, including Taiwan. Nearly, there's 195 UN member states. Nearly all of them, nearly every country recognizes China as the sole legitimate government of all of China. There's, I think, 11, 12, 13 countries, including Vatican, a couple of places in the Pacific, a couple of countries in Latin America. I think only one country in Africa that recognizes Taiwan, Eswatini, what was previously called Swaziland. There's only a small handful of countries that recognize Taiwan as the government of China. Even the US, right? Even Britain.
Well, it says a lot about those countries, like Swaziland is just a white supremacist colony in the middle of Africa. United States, I think it speaks for China that they don't recognize because we know their colonial interests. So
exactly. It's what the point I'm trying to make is that it's an issue of decolonization. If we oppose colonialism and we support decolonizing, then we support China's reunification. And we recognize that the only thing standing in the way of China's reunification is US imperialism. Taiwan is strategically important for the United States. It's a key part of the US's long-standing war of campaign of encirclement against China, against its as part of its First Island chain strategy. It's going to provide a potential flashpoint for a conflict. Potentially, it's is most likely, if there's going to be a hot war that the US ignites against China, then the spark will be Taiwan. So the US has been escalating its support for Taiwan, including record arms sales. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration announced that it was going to send $11 billion worth of weapons to Taiwan, which is a record and which is a violation of international law. So that very much undermines the one China principle. And over the last few years, and really ramped up, first under the Biden administration and now the Trump administration, the US has been ramping up its undermining of the one China principle, encouraging separatism. Biden stated explicitly something which goes against US official government policy and it goes against US-China agreements. The US would defend Taiwan militarily, right? Which is a huge escalation and a huge violation of things that have already been agreed. Japan recently, Prime Minister Takaichi, who's just gone to elections and has won a huge majority, over 2/3 majority, allowing her to lead a process of changing the constitution, moving away from Japan's pacifist constitution, potentially developing nuclear weapons. She's also said that if China were to try and change the status quo in the Taiwan Straits by force, then that would be an existential crisis for Japan, and Japan would have to defend itself militarily, which no Japanese prime minister has ever said before. So again, it's a big threat and a big escalation. I think China's approach to the whole situation has been very restrained, it's been very patient, and it hasn't actually changed much in the course of 75 years. China is clear that it's working towards reunification. It's working on peaceful development of relations, cross-strait relations. It reserves the right to use military methods for reunification. It specifically says that it wants peaceful reunification, but it reserves the right to use military means if Taiwan were to declare independence or if foreign forces were to get involved. And as I say, that policy has been in place for 75 years. The offer on the table for Taiwan to be absorbed into China is basically that everything stays the same. You maintain your economic policy the way you're doing it now. You maintain your culture, you maintain your parliamentary system. You have, similar to with Hong Kong, but much deeper, much wider ranging, one country, two systems. The only thing that would meaningfully change is that the foreign policy would obviously shift to Beijing. But this, it's a very flexible.
We have that in so many countries, right? We have federalism in the US, competitive federalism in the US, solidarity federalism in Brazil and in Germany. We have comunidades autónomas in Spain. It's just one unified state in France, and it's just the political organization of a country, nothing more.
Exactly, but China, as we said, plays the long game, right? They take a very long view, and Deng Xiaoping.
That's my problem, because when you're saying all those things, Carlos, because you're so well versed, I think we are already heading to the end of the world. Will there history to look back? That's what crosses my mind. I can't avoid the feeling. Will there? We have Trump. This could be the end of humanity before our lifetime. It's a scare, isn't it?
No, it's true. Deng Xiaoping always used to say, well, future generations will be smarter than us, and they'll figure out how to solve some problems that we haven't been able to solve. But you're right. There's a level of pressure now.
Yeah, you're very optimistic. I like that. It's good. It's good to think like that. Yeah, in a more generous perspective, trustworthy. Yeah. Carlos, I want you to tell people about Friends of Socialist China. What is this initiative about? How they can access the website and how people can engage.
Okay, so Friends of Socialist China was established coming up for 5 years ago. It's an online platform, principally a website that's based on understanding and supporting the People's Republic of China, understanding and supporting Chinese socialism. We aim to provide analysis, commentary, educational resources to counter this kind of pervasive misinformation and propaganda about China that's really prevalent
particularly in Western media. We aim to oppose the new Cold War. We aim to encourage friendship, encourage solidarity. We've got a website, which is socialistchina.org. Go to the website, sign up to the weekly newsletter. We publish an average of, I guess, 9 or 10 articles a week. It's a mix of our own writing and kind of useful material from across the internet. We put on regular webinars. We do some in-person events in Britain and in the United States. We've got all the usual social media channels. The Twitter is socialist_China. The YouTube is Friends of Socialist China. So
yeah, we're going to put down in. I hope we're going to put it somewhere so people can access this. Before I let you go, because I've took a lot of time, is there anything else you want to say, or that I haven't asked?
I think we've covered a lot.
Okay.
I've run out of words now.